Sometimes the people closest to us are not the ones who truly know us. And sometimes the ones watching from behind curtains, from across trimmed hedges and freshly painted fences, notice things we wish would remain invisible. And Margaret Collins had lived long enough to understand the quiet power of observation. The way silence could be louder than confrontation. The way a look held just a second too long could feel like a question that demanded an answer. And on that mild suburban morning, with soft piano music drifting faintly from the radio on her kitchen counter and the distant hum of lawnmowers blending with birdsong, Margaret stood at her sink holding a porcelain cup she had owned for decades, watching sunlight fall across the backyard she had once shared with a husband who laughed too loudly and worked too hard and left too early from this world. And for years after his passing, the house had settled into a predictable rhythm of solitude that felt safe if not fulfilling. But lately something had shifted. Something warm and unexpected had crept into the corners of her days, changing the way she woke up, the way she smiled at nothing, the way she felt time moving again instead of simply passing. And she would have kept that change carefully guarded if not for Mrs. Hargrove next door, whose presence could be felt even when she wasn't seen, whose curtains always seemed slightly parted, whose timing was impeccable in the way it made others uncomfortable. And it was Mrs. Hargrove who called out that morning as Margaret stepped outside to water her roses, her voice sweet but sharp-edged, remarking casually about how busy Margaret's yard had been lately and how nice it must be to have such youthful energy stopping by. How surprising it was to see a young man coming and going. And Margaret felt her stomach tighten as if the words themselves had reached inside her and twisted something private, something fragile, and she forced a polite smile while answering vaguely, feeling heat rise to her cheeks as she sensed judgment dressed up as curiosity. And once back inside her home, she leaned against the door and closed her eyes. Memories flooding in, uninvited memories of Ethan. Of the way he laughed when dirt smudged his face. Of how he spoke to her like she was not an elderly widow but simply a woman worth listening to. Of shared coffees in the shade of her garden and conversations that drifted from weather to regrets to dreams neither of them had expected to speak aloud. And she wondered how something so gentle could feel so dangerous. How companionship could suddenly carry the weight of scandal. And as the day unfolded, she replayed Mrs. Hargrove's words again and again, each repetition sharpening the embarrassment and the fear, reminding Margaret that the town she lived in thrived on unspoken rules and whispered corrections. And though she had lived there for decades, raised her daughter there, buried her husband there, she now felt like a trespasser in her own life, torn between the comfort of being unseen and the thrill of being alive again. And that night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks of her house, she realized the gossip had already begun, whether spoken aloud or not. And that once a story escapes into the minds of neighbors, it can never truly be taken back, only reshaped. And somewhere beyond her window, Mrs. Hargrove's porch light glowed steadily. A silent reminder that secrets rarely stay secret in places where people believe they are entitled to know everything. And Margaret, staring at the ceiling with her heart racing softly in the dark, understood that her quiet life was beginning to fracture, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had dared to feel something right. The days following that morning seemed to stretch and compress at the same time, as though the town itself had begun to lean in closer, listening, watching, waiting for Margaret to slip. And she noticed it in the smallest details, in the way conversations paused when she entered the grocery store aisle, in the polite smiles that lingered too long, in the sudden interest people took in her garden as they passed by. And though no one said anything directly, she felt exposed. as if her private moments with Ethan had been projected onto every trimmed lawn and church pew. And when her daughter Claire arrived one afternoon with Ollie trailing behind her, Margaret sensed immediately that the air between them had shifted. Claire's voice careful, her eyes scanning her mother's face with concern disguised as casual observation, asking how she had been sleeping, whether she was feeling well, whether anything new had been happening lately. And Margaret answered with practiced ease, offering tea, fussing over cookies, delaying the inevitable until Claire finally paused, setting her cup down with a quiet clink and asking softly if there was something her mother wasn't telling her. A question that landed heavily in Margaret's chest, because it was an accusation that frightened her but disappointment. The idea that her daughter might see her not as brave but as foolish, not as alive but as irresponsible, and Margaret hesitated, searching for words that could explain warmth without sounding desperate, companionship without sounding weak, love without sounding reckless, while Ollie watched from the couch, sensing tension without understanding it, flipping through a book and glancing up occasionally as if trying to read the room the way children instinctively do. And Margaret changed the subject, asking about school, about work, about anything except the truth pressing against her ribs. And when Claire left that evening, she hugged her mother longer than usual, whispering that people talked too much in small towns and that Margaret should be careful. And that word lingered long after the door closed, careful, as though happiness itself were something fragile and dangerous. And in the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. Mrs. Hargrove's influence subtle but unmistakable. Comments made in passing at church about propriety and dignity. Jokes at the market about cougar tendencies disguised as humor. And Margaret overheard enough fragments to piece together the story being written about her without her consent. A version of herself painted as lonely and inappropriate rather than warm and fulfilled. And she began to question herself in moments of weakness, wondering if she had mistaken kindness for affection, if she had allowed loneliness to blur lines that should have remained firm. And yet every time Ethan arrived, every time he greeted her with that easy smile and genuine interest in her day, those doubts softened, replaced by a feeling she had not known in years, a feeling of being present rather than preserved. And she found herself caught between two lives, one shaped by expectation and observation, the other by laughter and quiet understanding. And when Claire called again, her tone more serious this time, asking directly if there was someone in her mother's life, Margaret felt the walls closing in, realizing that silence was no longer protecting anyone but was instead allowing others to define her story for her. And that night she sat alone at her kitchen table long after the dishes were done, staring at her reflection in the darkened window, seeing not a reckless woman chasing youth but someone who had spent years honoring rules that brought no comfort. And she understood that the tension tightening around her was not simply about gossip or judgment, but about the fear of choosing herself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. And with that realization came the quiet knowledge that something would have to give, because the weight of unspoken truth was becoming heavier than the risk of speaking it aloud. The confrontation Margaret had both feared and anticipated arrived not in a dramatic explosion but in a quiet afternoon heavy with unsaid words. When Claire returned alone, her posture more rigid than before, her expression caught somewhere between concern and resolve. And Margaret knew before a single word was spoken that avoidance was no longer an option, that the careful balance she had been maintaining was about to tip. And as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table where so many ordinary conversations had taken place over the years, Claire finally asked the question outright, naming Ethan, naming the landscaper, naming the age difference that everyone else had already decided defined the entire story. And Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the truth, once cornered, had chosen to rise gently instead of fighting back, and she admitted it. Admitted that Ethan was kind and patient and attentive in a way she had not expected. Admitted that he made her laugh without trying and listen without judgment. Admitted that he made her feel alive in a way that had nothing to do with denying her age and everything to do with honoring her heart. And Claire listened, her face tightening at the mention of years and appearances and what people would think. Voicing fears Margaret herself had carried silently, that Ethan might be using her, that she might be setting herself up for heartbreak or ridicule. And Margaret responded not with defensiveness but with quiet certainty, explaining that she had lived long enough to recognize sincerity, that she had survived loss and solitude and did not intend to surrender joy simply because it arrived in an unexpected form. And as the conversation unfolded, memories threaded themselves through Margaret's words. Flashbacks of Ethan kneeling in the garden beside her, brushing soil from his hands as they talked about music and family, of him bringing coffee without being asked, of small gestures that carried no agenda. And Claire struggled visibly, torn between the daughter who wanted to protect her mother and the adult who had to acknowledge her mother's autonomy. And when Margaret spoke about discretion, about how she valued privacy not because she was ashamed but because some things deserved to be held gently rather than exposed to scrutiny, Claire softened, realizing perhaps for the first time that her mother was not asking for permission but for understanding. And it was in that softened silence that Claire agreed, reluctantly but honestly, to meet Ethan. Not as an interrogation but as an opportunity to see the man behind the rumors. And in the days that followed, Margaret felt both relief and dread, knowing that once Ethan crossed that threshold into her family's awareness, there would be no returning to anonymity. And she replayed their moments together with new eyes, wondering how they would look under scrutiny, whether the ease they shared would withstand judgment. And when Ethan arrived to discuss garden plans one morning, she watched him differently, noticing his nervousness when he sensed something had changed, noticing the care with which he chose his words. And for the first time she understood that the weight of gossip did not fall on her alone, that Ethan too was being pulled into a narrative he had not written. And as she lay awake that night, she realized the confrontation had not resolved her fears but had instead clarified them, revealing that what truly frightened her was not disapproval but the possibility that once seen clearly, once measured and weighed by others, her happiness might be deemed unacceptable. And yet beneath that fear was a growing resolve, a quiet strength built from years of endurance, telling her that whatever came next, she would meet it standing rather than hiding. The day Margaret decided to host a small backyard gathering arrived with a strange mixture of resolve and vulnerability, the kind that settles into your bones when you know you are stepping fully into visibility after a lifetime of blending quietly into the background. And as she arranged chairs beneath the old maple tree and set out simple plates and glasses, she could feel eyes on her from across the fence, could sense Mrs. Hargrove's presence without seeing her, the familiar weight of judgment hovering like humidity in the air. And yet Margaret moved deliberately, refusing to let hesitation dictate her actions, inviting a handful of close friends, family, and neighbors whose opinions had always mattered more than the whispers. And when Ethan arrived, dressed neatly and carrying flowers that felt both tender and symbolic, Margaret saw the flicker of nerves in his smile and squeezed his hand just briefly, a silent reassurance that this was a shared crossing, not one he would make alone. And Claire and Ollie observed closely as introductions were made, as conversations unfolded, as Ethan spoke with respect and humor, answering questions about his work and his life without defensiveness or pretense. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to shift, skepticism giving way to curiosity, curiosity to quiet acceptance. While beyond the hedges, Mrs. Hargrove whispered to another neighbor, her words sharp with disbelief, but for the first time Margaret did not feel the sting, because she was no longer hiding, and the gossip lost its power in the presence of honesty. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, laughter replaced awkward silences. Ollie found himself drawn to Ethan's playful energy, showing him a project he had been working on, and Claire watched it all unfold with a guarded but softening expression, recognizing consistency in Ethan's behavior that rumors could not erase. And Margaret felt a sense of grounding she had not expected, as though standing openly in her truth had anchored her rather than exposed her. And when Mrs. Hargrove finally made her presence known, offering a thin smile and a comment laced with judgment about surprises at any age, Margaret met her gaze calmly, responding with grace instead of apology. And in that moment something shifted irrevocably, because the power Mrs. Hargrove once held through observation and insinuation evaporated in the face of unapologetic choice. And as the gathering wound down and guests departed, Claire lingered, admitting quietly that while she still had concerns, she could no longer deny what she had seen. And Margaret, looking around her garden filled with fading light and the echoes of conversation, realized that public exposure had not destroyed her happiness as she had feared, but had instead stripped away the false narratives others had imposed, leaving only the simple truth of connection. And as she stood beside Ethan watching the sun dip lower, she understood that courage was not loud or defiant but steady, born from the decision to live honestly even when it would be easier to retreat. In the weeks that followed the gathering, something subtle yet profound settled into Margaret's life, a sense of ease she had not realized she had been missing, as though the constant background noise of judgment had finally faded into something distant and harmless, and she moved through her days with a lighter step, no longer flinching when she heard voices outside or when she noticed curtains shift, because the story others told about her had lost its authority the moment she chose to stop hiding. And Claire, though still cautious, began to visit more often, her conversations with Ethan growing more natural, less guarded, as she saw not a reckless young man chasing novelty but a patient presence who respected boundaries and valued consistency. And Ollie openly embraced him, asking questions, sharing jokes, finding in Ethan the kind of easy mentorship that grows not from obligation but from genuine interest. And Margaret watched these connections form with quiet gratitude, understanding that acceptance rarely arrives all at once but unfolds gradually through repeated proof, through the steady alignment of words and actions. And in the background Mrs. Hargrove remained, still observant, still silent more often than not, her curiosity now dulled by Margaret's indifference, because the power she once wielded depended entirely on Margaret's fear, and without it she was simply another neighbor watching life continue without her approval. And in the mornings Margaret and Ethan shared coffee on the porch, talking about plans both small and tentative, about gardens and trips that might happen someday, about memories that shaped them and hopes that no longer felt foolish to voice. And Margaret found herself reflecting on how much of her life she had spent adhering to expectations she never consciously chose, honoring rules designed to keep people comfortable rather than fulfilled. And she understood now that freedom did not arrive with dramatic declarations but with quiet persistence, with the decision to keep choosing joy even when it invited scrutiny. And as seasons shifted and the garden changed under their shared care, Margaret felt herself changing too, not becoming someone new but reclaiming parts of herself that had been set aside for the sake of order and appearance. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and cast warm light across the porch where she and Ethan sat hand in hand, she glanced briefly toward the neighboring house and saw Mrs. Hargrove standing there, watching as she always had. But this time Margaret did not look away or stiffen or feel the urge to justify herself, because the gaze no longer mattered, and in that stillness she realized the quiet truth she wished she had known sooner, that life does not reward those who live cautiously for the sake of others' comfort, but those who dare to live honestly for the sake of their own hearts. And as the light faded and the world softened into evening, Margaret felt a deep, unshakable peace, knowing that happiness had not come from defying judgment but from refusing to let it define her, and that love, in its truest form, does not follow the clock or the rules or the expectations whispered from behind fences, but simply follows what makes us feel alive, whole, and unafraid to be seen.